work time.
The phone live.
Do you care for any coffee? Anything? Okay, water. Okay. All right. Are we?
We're ready.
Thank you. All right. Good morning, board members, those of you who are here in person, as well as those of you who are joining this board meeting through digital platform and virtually, as well as those who are following this board meeting, members of the public, as it is being streamed live. This is now time for us to call the roll and determine a quorum, please.
Estela Hernandez. Here. Kurt Bolenbach.
Okay.
Here.
Carlisha Bradley Williams.
Here.
Bill Flanagan.
Here.
Brian Bobeck.
Here.
Jennifer Menning.
Here.
Superintendent Hoffman.
Here. All right. We have a quorum. We are all here on the phone. And by the way, it is wonderful to see board member Bill Flanagan, who we have missed for a number of weeks, and we're so pleased to see you joining the meeting this way. Board members, this meeting will include teleconferencing or video conferencing, but there will be parties present at the Oliver Hodge building here today as well. And so we have just heard who is here present and who is here virtually as well. There is also a public Facebook page right now that anyone is able to go to at facebook.com/OKLA SDE, Okla SDE. I'd like to share with you some information before we begin today's business. As an update on the coronavirus, we have 106 positive cases as of yesterday. We know that number is going to change again today. There were, very sadly, 3 deaths already in our state. Governor Stitt announced yesterday that he is enforcing a safer at home order statewide. If you haven't read that, that is available to go through, and this directs Oklahomans who are particularly vulnerable to the virus to shelter in their homes until April the 30th, and that restricts their movements only for trips for essentials like groceries and medicine. Vulnerable populations are the elderly, and those immunocompromised or with pre-existing health conditions. The governor also closed all non-essential businesses in the counties with confirmed COVID-19 cases. And I believe that is at 19 counties right now. This includes gyms, salons, theaters, and museums. Gatherings of 10 or more are prohibited. I'd also like to draw your attention to some very important call to action, and that is related to a donation request to support our hospitals and nursing homes. On Friday, I sent a letter to our school leaders asking for their help with the desperate shortage of medical supplies. We asked them to donate based on information that the Hospital Association provided to us of areas of greatest need, which are any unused masks, eye protection, gloves, disinfectant wipes, and hand sanitizers, and that they are to provide those to their local nursing homes or hospitals. There is a desperate need for this, and it is in many of our schools, in closets, in various warehouse and supply areas that could be better used right now. We also want to talk about the waivers that we received at the federal level, and I have to thank and applaud the incredibly responsive effort and hard work at the U.S. Department of Education. And also I want to say how much it meant when U.S. Secretary Betsy DeVos gave a phone call yesterday to connect with me and to ask personally if there is anything that they can do, and we had a list of a few things, and they are already working on providing what is needed in regard to some of these federal dollars as well. But they were very swift in the response to our critical waiver submitted last Friday. The opening for submission was on Friday. We submitted that day, and we received approval that same evening. And that also occurred for at least 16 other states. ESSA requires that each state administer academic assessments in English, language arts, mathematics, and science in grades 3 through 8, as well as ones in high school. So these assessments were suspended for the 2019-20 school year, which ensures some level of stability and flexibility in light of these extraordinary circumstances in which we find ourselves. The school report card, as a result, will not be able to be provided this year. That's the Oklahoma school report card. That is not the same as a individual student's report card. That actually will go forward, and we can address that a little bit sooner, in just a little bit. Both assessments and the state report card for schools are very important tools, but they, of course, do not outweigh the safety and health and well-being of our students, the school staff, and communities that we serve. I also want to talk a little bit about the meals that are needed during closure of schools. You may be aware already that 61% of Oklahoma school children qualify for free and reduced price lunch. Many Oklahomans depend on that nutritional meal in breakfast or lunch at the school, and when the school is closed, they are going to be in greater need of keeping nutritional support going. So during this closure, we have worked with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to secure those national waivers that are needed to allow our schools to deliver grab-and-go curbside meals, to also have the ability for a delivery of those meals on bus routes into neighborhoods. And we've also received approval to have a program called Meals to You, which allows for the delivery of up to 10 meals to our students that are needing that a week at a time through the U.S. mail. And this will help in some of our remote areas and where we may not be able to count on bus transportation to get that, or the curbside drive-through delivery of those. This is something that all states are working through, and we are just incredibly blessed to have a team of child nutrition staff here at the department and those that are working in local school districts who are working around the clock, literally around the clock. I think there was a call made and some guidance given close to midnight or after midnight in D.C. With people in Oklahoma over the weekend on Saturday. So this has been truly just phenomenal work, and I applaud all of those who are helping make sure that they have new plans in local schools to continue these services. Let me tell you about another area, and one that will really be the focus of our board meeting. We have a group of people in the department that cut across all different offices, and they are led by Aaron Espelt of the State Department of Education, Executive Director of School Design and Innovation. And there is a host of tireless and dedicated members of OSDE staff who have been working to develop a distance learning framework. And this is what our districts are going to need as they are looking through their own plans as we deliver distance learning in a different way than they have even delivered for those 200-some school districts that already have virtual learning. That it will look a little differently without some of that face-to-face interaction. So distance learning frameworks and resources that we anticipate will be on the agency's website at sde.ok.gov by the end of the week. These are going to be the fruit of this labor. It will be a lot of material, but we believe these resources and guidance will be of real value for our schools navigating through this period. And Oklahoma has tremendous educators, strong and dedicated and smart. We have faith and confidence that our districts and teachers are committed to creative and innovative ways to continue learning for their students, and they will rise to the challenge. It's going to look different for all schools, and we have to accept that. Many districts long to have online tools and want to have resources to be able to hit the ground running. Some have them and some do not. So this is now an area where we will provide more support at the state level, and we are asking for support at the federal level to free up the use of some of our existing federal funds to be used to support distance learning. Other districts have little connectivity and communities with little or no access to computer technology. But again, we're working at the state level with those providers to work to ensure as much connectivity as possible in the coming weeks. This is far from ideal, but these are extraordinary situations for us, and we have never experienced this before. Speaking of extraordinary, it's the first time in history that we have had today a virtual state Board of Education meeting. It's emblematic of how we must adapt to the times to be able to continue to carry on the important work of education. Our education communities are tough, they're resilient, and they're committed. They know, as we all do, that we are all in this together. If this pandemic underscores anything, it is that we must help one another, we must care for one another, and we must love one another. And with that, we will begin considering what we can do at the state level to assist our schools in moving from a defensive posture, which was to take care of the safety of our children, our staff, and our communities by staying at home right now after spring break, after all that travel and this protected period of time, and also the nutrition and keeping our children healthy and their well-being top of mind in that defensive work that we are engaged in currently. And then I'm asking that we now move into offense. Let's keep learning happening, and let's move and ask that question and then implement what that answer will be to how do we keep our kids learning and growing, how do we continue, how do we make certain that we will not lose ground, that our children can keep momentum building. And this is what the next phase is about, beginning on April the 6th. All right, board members, I would like to turn your attention to item number 2-A, which is discussion and possible action on our minutes from our February 27th regular state board meeting. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
We have a motion from Ms. Monies,
Second.
and we have a second from Ms. Hernando. All right, is there any comment or questions on this action item? All right, please call the roll.
Ms. Money,
Aye.
Mr. Bobeck,
Abstain.
Ms. Bradley Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan,
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach,
Aye.
Ms. Hernandez. Aye. Superintendent Hoffmeister.
Aye. All right, thank you. That motion carries. All right, our next item is the discussion and possible action to amend the March 16th, 2020 Order of Mandatory Statewide Cessation of Operations for the Public Schools of Oklahoma due to the coronavirus COVID-19 global pandemic. Mr. Clark.
Superintendent, members of the board, as reflected on the agenda and just read by Superintendent Hoffmeister, this item is to reconsider and possibly amend this board's March 16th, 2020 order that mandatorily ordered the cessation of operations in the public schools. Other provisions is provided therein. I believe that with the superintendent's opening comments, it is appropriate to open this up and consider amending that March 16th order. You do have a recommendation before you this morning as to the recommended modifications to that order, but at this time, we'll open it up for any discussion.
Yes,
Questions?
I think that's very important. We would like to open that up for you to discuss, and those of you who I know have all been really wrestling with what is the right next step. We do know we have executive order in place, which calls on all of us to observe the CDC guidance with no more than 10 gathering at a time, and to implement social distancing as well, which came as we were in the middle of preparing for today's board meeting, as well, the governor's new executive order. But let's have a conversation about this, please.
First, I want to thank you and the State Department of Education because you have been very diligent in your leadership, and also Mr. Clark has spent countless hours in organizing and keeping the board informed, listening as you as well have done. But being that this is a historic meeting that's being done online, and just minutes before beginning the meeting, there were some amendments, or not, the recommendation was amended slightly. If you could read that recommendation in its entirety, so that way the entire board and everyone listening virtually could also understand what's in it.
Sure. Thank you. Very much appreciate that. The recommendation before you at this time reads as follows. Pursuant to the powers, authority, and duties vested by the Oklahoma Constitution and the State of Oklahoma, the Oklahoma State Board of Education hereby orders, effective immediately, the following. Suspend in-person instruction and extracurricular activities in closed buildings for the remainder of the school year, recommended ending date on or after May 8th through the 15th, 2020, for general student and personnel attendance. Exceptions authorized among public schools and their staff shall be those who are to provide nutrition services, essential core services. Examples include governance, HR, billing, maintenance, and continuity of building functions. Staff to maintain building access control and security measures, as well as student enrollment functions. Additional authorizations include staff for the purposes of facilitating or supporting required delivery of distance learning as set forth in more detail below. Secondly, now through April 6th, there's an established and dedicated window to do the following. Provide the Oklahoma State Department of Education with expedited waiver and assurances for each district, and prepare for and begin distance learning. Preparations may include immediately convening staff development consistent with the intent and purposes of this order. Third, in consideration of the waivers considered and potentially granted by the State Board of Education at this March 25th, 2020 special meeting, districts will provide the following assurances through the 2019-20 school year. Again, recommended ending date on or after May 8th through the 15th, 2020. Assurances include taking into account the needs and resources of each local community and the students' needs, develop and implement an approved distance learning plan. Districts who utilize the OSDE State Department of Education's distance learning resources will be expedited for review. Districts electing not to use the State Department of Education distance learning resources must develop a learning plan and submit the proposed framework to the State Department of Education for review and approval. Secondly, assurances include districts must complete and return the survey sent by the State Department of Education on March 24th, 2020, assessing the technology capacity of their staff and community, and report the results back in the manner and time frame determined by the State Department of Education. Third, districts must assure compliance with FERPA, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, including assuring that they have read and understand the most recent fact sheets and guidelines provided by federal and state agencies. Districts adhere and comply with CDC guidelines and apply a health and safety policy that ensures students, staff, and families are not exposed to potential pathogens that could lead to illness. Next, districts will continue to enroll all new students according to the state statute and school district enrollment policies, and provide educational plans for students that are new to the district for the duration of the school year. Districts will comply with the requirements stipulated in executive orders from the Office of the Governor of the State of Oklahoma. Turning to the awarding of credits, this is primarily a local function of school districts, but this board, as proposed, would encourage and recommend that districts utilize that flexibility so that students graduating in the class of 2020 or earlier, or who were on track to graduate before the gubernatorial declaration of emergency in March of 2020 and any subsequent amendments thereto, are not negatively impacted by measures taken by each local education agency or the state in response to the novel coronavirus, COVID-19. Consistent with the above, the state board will consider waivers and flexibilities that are on the agenda this morning at the March 25th, 2020 special meeting, and to authorize the Oklahoma State Department of Education to grant these waivers for the duration of the school year as set forth above. Nothing in this order is intended to interfere with contracts between public schools and employees, and the staff of public schools are expected to carry out the terms and conditions of their contracts as entered into or later amended between the parties. In carrying out the terms of this order, the public schools shall adopt any policies or regulations necessary to comply with this order. And finally, this first amended order of the State Board of Education will be continuously monitored and updated accordingly.
Thank you. All right, so let's have any discussion about this. I think it's important to talk about what's here.
The one question that I have, and I'm so grateful you mentioned that you spoke with Secretary DeVos in regards to uniquely what's happening in Oklahoma, and we know that every state is dealing with it in vastly different ways. What was that conversation like? If you can give us a bit about her take. Did you discuss school closures? Mm-hmm. The reason being, or building closures per se, because learning continues. In the U.S. Department of Education and their release and their fact sheet as of March 21st, they specifically mentioned that they want to remind schools that they should opt not to close or decline to provide distance instruction, which we are, and that is what we're doing here. What was her take? Did you share with her the direction that this body wants to go in?
And that was exactly the conversation. It was, as we prepare for distance learning, what kind of support could they provide, and what kind of help do we need? Of course, that is why we were given a waiver as well for the U.S. Requirements on testing, and accountability among many other states that are also taking very similar steps. I think that what is discouraged and being asked to reconsider would be if a school or a state were to call off class for the remainder of the school year where there would be no learning. That is a concern that certainly we would have as well. And actually, I think part of taking the steps now to be able to shift to distance learning makes the continuing of the school year possible. If we were to wait, and I have had a number of emails and phone calls and messages about, can't we wait a few weeks to decide if this is something that needs to be considered? The answer is no. We really can't. Districts can't stand up that kind of robust, meaningful program unless we take this time right now for them to engage in that, so that there will be a meaningful number of weeks to deliver that service and provide that. It isn't possible for districts to flip a switch and shift into that kind of delivery of education without advance notice. And so we haven't given very much, but we've given enough because we are still deeper into the year than if we were 2 or 3 weeks down the road. And I just want to remind people, my thought on this is it's always better to plan and prepare now than in a crisis. And so this is how I believe we actually gain ground in education instead of lose ground when there could be a time of disarray, confusion, when whole blocks of, workforce are prohibited from interacting, and the time to plan and make these provisions set and secure would be missed. But there was definitely support for the continuing of school and articulating that very specifically about the appreciation that we are committed to continuing the school year.
I think for me, sorry, go ahead, someone on the phone.
Was that Mr. Flanagan?
Yeah. The individual education plans under the federal, do all those plans need to be amended since we are now changing the requirements initially under those individual education plans?
That's a very good question, and we do have an answer for you. I'll let Brad, though, share that.
Sure. Sir, the answer is possibly. They are, as they say, they are individualized, and so there are very likely plans that may not need to be amended, and we know that there are plans that will definitely need to be amended, but that's an individual case-by-case review that the school districts are prepared to engage in, and that is one of the assurances, again, that I read to you all earlier.
Also, on that line of thinking, we have received guidance from the U.S. Department of Education about how to ensure that IDEA is met under the constraints of the coronavirus. And this is something that we will be asking our districts to be sure they've reviewed and then give us that assurance that they will comply.
And they have to do that in order to get to the approval for all of the waivers, right?
Yes,
as part
that's right.
Of their plan.
It's conditional for the waiver of other items that we will consider today.
I think for me personally, and I know I speak for the full board, we've all, been in very close contact over the last several weeks. We're all here with the purpose of making sure that every student gets a quality education. And, this pandemic obviously presents incredibly trying times to make sure that happens. I've been on multiple calls, not only with State Department of Education, but with school districts, talking about distance learning. I've seen my own kids' school trying to adapt. Last night, they both got videos from their teachers, which they loved. And, I think we just want to continue to encourage, and I know school districts, are thinking about this, but this period of time, and I too, and like all the other board members, I think have gotten a lot of feedback of like, why do we have to do this now? And my answer has been, we have to give districts the maximum amount of time to think through and innovate and think through how they can potentially reach every single one of their students. We all know that students are all very different, many of whom are on IEPs, many of whom have unique situations that need to be addressed during this time as well. And so giving districts the ability and time to think through how to reach every single student in their building and try to continue education as best as they can over the coming weeks. I think that we are giving districts the opportunity to try and deliver education to students in what is a very unprecedented time. So I definitely want to thank the State Department. I want to thank districts out there that are thinking differently. I want to encourage everybody, to get groups, not in person, but virtually groups of, teachers together. I know there are a lot of really innovative teachers across our state to try something different and to try and reach as many students as they possibly can during this time. I know it'll be especially trying on the students. I've heard from a lot of students personally who are just devastated that they don't get to finish out the school year. And I know that is really hard. I know that it's going to be incredibly hard on parents from all different walks of life, whether they're having to work from home or they're having to work outside the home and having to figure out how to educate their students at the same time. So I know that the weight of this decision definitely does not go unnoticed by this board, but given the emphasis and need to protect our students and staff's health, I feel like that we have to do what we can to move online and try and get education to students as best we can. So that is what we are here to do today.
Thank you. I appreciate how you are each describing the thought process and the struggle, recognizing the struggle. I know others virtually want to join in as well in this discussion.
So I, again, want to echo the sentiments of the other board members and just sharing great appreciation for the State Department, to you, Superintendent Hoffmeister, for your leadership during this time. I think that as we talk about distance learning, it's really important that we acknowledge that distance learning does not mean that it's technology-based or online, because that is an equity gap across our state. We know that we serve many students who do not have access, and so there is a unique burden on several of our districts to deliver services in a different way. I mean, they don't have necessarily the access at home to teach a student online, and teachers will be thinking through how to innovate in special ways, and I'm grateful for the waivers and the ways that we can support those districts. I also think that when we do return to normalcy in school, that there's additional barriers that those districts that were not able to have the close points of touch with students through technology might face as well. And so we'll continue to think about how to support those districts. But ultimately, during this time, as we're engaging in this conversation about distance learning, many people automatically assume that means online, but we're forgetting about our most vulnerable students who do not have that access. And so although this is a very difficult decision to make, health is the top priority. I also think that it calls on our community to support school districts and our State Department as we're delivering instruction in a very different way, unprecedented time. But we do have to think about the students who do not have access, and the parents who might still be working and need those additional supports from the community, however we can during this time as well.
Thank you. Thank you. And you've mentioned that it is not all computer-based, and that is accurate. In fact, we have a partnership with Oklahoma's public broadcasting affiliate, which is OETA, with 11 different towers all across the state that reach into homes where even cellular service is not provided or reaching. And we're talking with Polly Anderson, the executive director for OETA, as we would like her to look at how we could deliver educational support for our children through some of the resources that PBS has available. And we are grateful that they are working at OETA very hard to connect with our curriculum and instruction team here and looking at programming that is already grade specific, subject and content specific, and how that will connect with our Oklahoma academic standards and our curriculum framework. And there's discussion about helping to place that onto daytime programming so that our teachers have that as yet another tool. Other board members?
I would just like to let everyone know a lot of people have probably reached out to all of us during this time, from administrators to parents, business owners, legislators, and this decision is not made without taking into consideration everyone's 2 cents on this. Healthcare experts have reached out, so I want everyone out there to understand that your voice is being heard. And so I appreciate people reaching out to us and giving us their thought, giving us their expertise, or just their feelings and emotions in a what is nothing less than a strange time. So as we move forward with this, I just want everyone to know that we've heard their voices.
Thank you. Certainly, thank you.
One of the other comments I would like to make in regards to those individuals who have reached out and who have been diligent in expressing their concerns is the reading that Mr. Clark did really goes into the flexibility and taking into consideration those graduating students for the class of 2020. And this that we will be voting on takes into account that we're giving them the flexibility and the districts the flexibility to be able to decide how that will look like. So it's not to where we're shutting things down and not giving that hope that those 4 years that they have spent in pouring out all that they are, that it will be acknowledged and that we will find creative ways to make sure that that is acknowledged, and also that this can also be amended. And that is the concern that they have, that we are going to, by closing buildings, that we are now essentially shutting out their hard work and acknowledging of that. The second and last comment that I want to point out is that there are schools in the state of Oklahoma who are set up for such a time as this in education, that they are not disrupted during a crisis like a pandemic as this. And that's a few of our virtual schools, charter schools, and I want to acknowledge them, and also in noticing that as of April 6th, in this order, once they submit that assurance document, they're able to start immediately. So that's the way I understand it. And Mr. Clark and Superintendent Hoffmeister, please correct me if I'm wrong. I want to make sure that they know that this will not put any additional barriers to them starting immediately.
Thank you. And you're correct. We don't want to hold up the education of any of our students, and we know that some are ready to go right now and others are not. We want to afford the time that's needed in others that are working to develop that, but you have raised a good point. The last thing we want to do is stall the ability to have education continue for students, and they shouldn't have to wait. I would like to mention something about graduation ceremonies, and I am already hearing some really creative ways of celebrating, and I know we will have many other stories like this, but I do think it's worth noting. One superintendent mentioned that they're considering having a virtual graduation ceremony, and this is a very large school district that would celebrate online, where people could watch this live streaming from anywhere in the country. Those vulnerable family members that certainly would not be traveling would be able to participate and watch at the same time, where each senior would be given their name called with their senior picture displayed, and that they would give honor to each one of them and even have a time to deliver the message from the valedictorian, other elements of a graduation ceremony that we have come to hold really dear could be included. Of course, it's going to be different, but we can find creative ways to honor that work and that accomplishment that our students have achieved. Also, I heard a school that is a part of rural Oklahoma with a main street, and they said that they are going to do or are considering doing a parade of cars with each of the graduates in their own vehicle, with celebrating through Main Street for all of their graduates. There are ways that we can continue to honor students. It is going to be different, and we recognize that. And there's just not a way around that right now. But it is a time where I think we will continue to be inspired by the creativity of those who seek to connect with our kids and honor the accomplishment and work of many years.
Superintendent, can you talk about any conversations that you've had with the Department of Human Services as far as potentially leaving students who see school as a refuge from difficult home situations? What is the department doing with the Department of Human Services to try to mitigate any of those situations as much as possible during this time?
I'm really glad you brought that up. It is on our hearts as well, and part of our thinking and planning. We are in conversation and have been a part of meetings with DHS, and it is a very real thing that school is the safe place for many of our kids. And what I would like to say here is just like when, I heard another superintendent remind me that growing up in Oklahoma, and I've had the same conversation myself when I was with my parents when I was young. Just like church is not the building, it's the people that are a part of that. School is not the building either. It is the people, the connection between students and their teachers and those who support them, those who are preparing the meals and delivering the meals, and those who are leading in those decisions. That is school. That is the delivery of education. And we want those connections to happen right away. So this is part of that, but you have identified an area that we do want to keep our all those who have some type of virtual connection with our students, whether it's phone calls or through some kind of digital online or Zoom or meeting or Google Classroom, that they keep in mind that we still have obligations to keep kids safe. And we have included in our distance learning framework a mental health component that reminds our teachers and our school administrators about how to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, to look for signs of stress. And we know that that is real among adults, and it's going to be real for children too. So that is part of our distance learning framework, and we recognize this is where we need the whole community to continue to support our kids. So thank you for bringing that up.
And I think just, furthering that, as far as, there's a lot of discussion about teachers and kind of helping teachers figuring out how to do some of this distance learning. I think also helping our counselors, connect to our students and continuing that as much as we can, I think will be really important during this time.
Yes, and we have a group of counselors that are working with counselors. In fact, later this week, I believe, it is on Friday, we have our counselor advisory group where we're going to be meeting virtually to discuss this and a host of other things as we prepare for our kids in their senior class that are on track for graduation to be able to have a smooth transition into their post-secondary pursuits, whether that be the military or career tech certification completion or into higher education. And those opportunities need to be a seamless transition, and we're committed to still providing that. Grades are an issue. How that impacts Oklahoma's promise, the student's GPA. These are all parts of the information we'll be sharing with districts. We're not going to rush that. It has to be done when it's done, and we have set for ourselves also the deadline of April 6th. However, many of this work that I'm discussing now will be ready before then.
I have a question,
Mr.
George.
Bobek.
Yes, thank you. Point of clarity, Brad, on the comments in regards to honor before May 8th through the 15th. Kind of expound on that. I was thinking that the last day of school originally was set for like the 22nd.
Thank you, sir. Actually, each of those determinations is a local determination year over year between each school district and their Board of Education. In this instance, in the circumstances, as we've continued conversations early on into the late evening hours, and then this morning, I believe districts are best set with a firm, narrow time frame of here is the recommended time frame from the state of Oklahoma, this body, as to the end of the year. That way they can start building these individual district plans accordingly. And so that was the guidance that we received. But generally speaking, the school calendars are district by district.
Also, I think it's important to mention, just to kind of expand on that input for your benefit, just to know, we have been holding meetings, virtual meetings with, and telephone conferences with our superintendent advisory group. We had one on Sunday afternoon. We also have had basically every other day a very large call. The last one that we had was with our school and district leaders with 1,178 participants. And they are sharing questions, ideas. We are keeping them alerted to decisions that could be coming so that they could have advanced time to begin thinking. Well, while I say the word advanced, we're talking about only a matter of days or week, but it is still what is needed. And in those conversations, we have heard from our district leaders that they would appreciate a date or a range of window for the closure of the school year in terms of the instruction component, so that they can shift their work to any kind of summer school support that needs to be in place as well through a different model, if that's warranted. And then also work to prepare all of their personnel through virtual meetings with some of the professional development and support that has been interrupted because of the closure that we have had right now with a fixed time where districts were asked to stay home and their personnel to stay home. So we want to provide districts with what they need, and Mr. Clark mentioned how it is very important for them to take that date and back all of that up to where we are today, and they know what they need to cover, and it allows them then to all be working in unison and learning from one another at the very same time, and we'll be able to support them more together. This also makes it very clear that we do not expect a district to simply say, well, this is too much for us to consider, and we're going to simply say we are done. That's unacceptable. We are here to help, and we are here to identify needs, identify hurdles, and get past those, but we are here to also advocate for our kids' continuous learning, and that needs to continue, and we'll get through these barriers.
Just quickly, if I can add one point, Mr. Bobek unintentionally omitted a minute ago. Nothing in what is recommended or proposed prohibits a district. Each district can determine as they deem necessary to continue beyond that recommended date. So I did want to emphasize that this is a recommendation, and nothing would prohibit as deemed necessary for each district to continue beyond that.
And I was going to add to that, that was my understanding, but also to say, you know, I've heard of some districts looking at, we know that this will potentially put some students behind, especially students who started behind. Yeah. And so looking at districts being able to continue their continuous learning plan through the summer, if that is something that district chooses to do, this gives them the ability to do that. So there's no hard stop. That's right. As far as when this has to stop and start, was my understanding.
Completely agree. And even to bolster that point you've made just now, the portion that I read about awarding of credits, recall that I read the portion about not negatively impacting students as a result of these circumstances we were in. So I think, to your point, that should also be taken into consideration locally.
Thank you.
Other comments?
Well, I just wanted to thank you both for those explanations, and to echo what my colleagues have said, obviously this is not an easy choice. Everybody has spent a lot of time thinking through this. I do want to thank Joy and Brad for all the many countless hours I know you and your team have put in. You know, Joy, kind of to what you said earlier, it's times like this where we see resilience and people rise up and communities rise up and overcome. And so I'm expectant that will be what we will see here in our state. And at the end of the day, I feel like that this is the best choice for the students and family long term. So thanks again.
Superintendent, can you talk about, you know, I know there have been a lot of education vendors opening up their platforms for free to parents and schools. What kind of resources are you hearing about, and how will that be communicated from the State Department to districts, to parents, as far as resources that are available to help them kind of bridge that gap between, you know, even you know, options that aren't online?
That's a very good point. Some of those will be provided as tools that we have vetted that can be reviewed for districts in the distance learning framework, but also there are already contracts that are available statewide for districts to participate in, and there are some of these existing contracts are related to the statewide virtual charter school board has supplemental materials that a district can tie into if they would like in their traditional school lesson planning and delivery. And we know that there are already some of our districts that are participating in that. So it is, you're correct. There's, right now, I would say we're probably being inundated with a lot of tools and offers for help. And boy, we sure do appreciate knowing about those things. We will try to give our districts some guidance through that. Here's what's available now when it comes to tools to use, platforms that they could use. But I want you to also know that we are working with the governor's secretaries, Secretary Ostro, who is looking at this digital connectivity piece. We also are working with Secretary of State and Secretary of Education, Michael Rogers, and he has brought these teams together with career tech and higher education, OneNet, other resources that the state is already in, large contracts that we have also in some ways can leverage buying power. But we also know that there's going to be some relief, federal relief coming as well for some of these purposes. So all of that is being considered right now, and we have a survey to districts that will ask questions and is due back on Friday at 9 a.m. And that survey will not take that long to complete, but it is asking for a very broad overview of what do you have now, what do you need, what would you do if you had the computers, what would you do if you had the hotspots for mobile device connection, and what do you need, and where are those gaps, so that we can begin looking at a longer view of getting those things ready. I think it's important to look at what is happening in Oklahoma compared to the trends, the mathematical models we're looking at right now, compared to the other states and other countries that are a few weeks ahead of us with COVID-19 and the disruption and the need for securing people in place and reducing the connection between people physically. And what we learned there is that this is not likely to be short term. But I do want people to remember it is temporary. It isn't permanent. And in that, it is also 100% worth the struggle that schools and families will go through to keep our families safe and our communities safe, and to try to reduce community transmission of the virus. If we do that, we will be able to handle that in hospitals as people will become sick, and not have an overwhelmed situation where those who could have been treated and survived may not, if we overwhelm the hospitals by not taking these very drastic steps right now. But it is in that spirit. We have to remember, it is temporary. Looking at this though, it could be something that we revisit, and this board will have to stay vigilant to watch and learn from what the data tells us. And it is very likely that we will be continuing conversations about what does it look like for summer learning? What does education in Oklahoma look like in the fall? And we have to think in some ways that the steps we are taking right now may be a dry run for what may come in this temporary time of extraordinary delivery of education. But if we are fortunate, and if it is possible to come back to ordinary school delivery of face-to-face instruction, we will have gained a lot through this. And what we will have gained is access to online learning for more kids than we had at this date. We will be able to modernize some of what our schools have wanted for a long time, to deliver individualized learning, to be able to have more of a blended model. So I think we come through this certainly stronger, but also better prepared to meet the needs of our kids going forward.
And that's one thing that stood out to me, and this number might not be correct, so correct me if I'm wrong, but knowing that I believe over 200 school districts in Oklahoma have some form of virtual offering now for some students. So I think that that's very encouraging as we kind of move forward, to know that some districts, a lot of districts in our state, are already doing this in some way. I agree with Carlicia that this will also highlight a lot of the inequities, especially on the digital connectedness side, and kind of, I think, will force our state and other states to look at what do we need to do to expand and make sure that students across our state have access to broadband internet, and make sure that they have, equal access to online offerings from an educational standpoint. And so, I agree that if there is a silver lining in any of this, it will force conversations of how does education need to look different, and how can we make sure that every kid in Oklahoma has has the ability to access the same quality education as every other student in the state. So I think those are going to be ongoing discussions as we kind of come out of this.
Thank you. I agree with you. And I see heads nodding here
Definitely appreciate you bringing that up, Jennifer, in regards to the fact that there are many districts where students have already begun blended learning. I also think just during this time that even greater deepens those gaps of students and their access right now. And so keeping that at the forefront of the silver lining of how do we come out of this and ensure that that access is afforded to our most vulnerable students, but also in knowing that that gap exists right now, what are we going to do about that as a board, as a State Department, as a community, as districts, to ensure that we can serve the students in the best way that we can during this time.
Board members, I also want you to be aware that there are other supports available to support our school leaders and our teachers. Right now, we have another program that we have had in the works called Project ECHO, which is part of the telemedicine delivery of consultation and work among colleagues around a particular issue of importance. And we have 3 lines in Project ECHO. They are all now devoted to COVID-19 and working through these hurdles and barriers in partnership with OSU Medical Center. And so we are an OSU College of Education as well. So we are working to help support in very, very real ways, but also in that arena of conversation around problem solving. And we have this mechanism called Project ECHO, which is part of, for us, tele-ed. And we then connect with those decision makers to walk through a struggle and learn from that collectively across the state. So that will continue. And if people are unaware of that and want to be a part of that, I understand we had hundreds that were a part of that this week. So we will continue to get the word out on that. One other thing to mention, I do think it's worth mentioning here that I have a great concern for our healthcare providers and the child care that they need for their students that are in school. And this is something other states have wrestled with. We have seen that addressed in different ways. This is something that Oklahoma began a discussion about in some of the very first early meetings that we had with agency heads. And while we're not able right at this moment to share out what that plan would be, it is top of mind as well. We know that our healthcare providers are giving every ounce of energy all day long and extra long shifts, and they are doing this in, again, historically significant conditions that are desperately in need of their hand wipes and gowns and gloves and all sorts of personal protection equipment that they are needing right now in this moment. So we do want to get the message that this is still something to work through for them, but we are committed to finding support. All right. Any other board member that has a comment or something to consider before we consider action? All right. All right, then I would ask if, oh, Carlisha.
Oh, I was just going to make the motion if we were ready.
All right. Yes.
I move that we approve the recommended order for school closure for the remainder of the school year.
I second her motion.
All right, and any further discussion? We will have this order available very shortly for everyone to be able to see. And just a reminder that this order is the beginning of distance learning statewide so that learning can continue. All right. Let's call the motion.
Ms. Hernandez.
Call the roll, excuse me.
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach.
Aye.
Ms. Bradley Williams.
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan.
Yes.
Mr. Bobeck.
Aye.
Ms. Money.
Aye.
Superintendent Hofmeister.
Aye. All right, that motion carries. Thank you very much, board members, for that work. But we have more work to do. And this is important business that we would like to entertain at this time to provide additional relief to schools as we deliver education in a different way. Mr. Clark, item 3, and we're on item 3A.
All right, thank you, Superintendent. Board members, continuing this next phase of the agenda, phase 2, if you will. Again, the board's authority in the Constitution of the State of Oklahoma and the statutes authorize the granting of the waivers and deregulations, set forth on the agenda. I believe each item merits discussion, and so if it's okay with you, I would take a moment to go through each one of these items one by one and request action on each individual item.
And also, I believe there are going to be some items that we're going to ask that you pull off the agenda or table.
Correct.
And as we go through them, then if you would provide an explanation for that reasoning.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
So starting with the first, the school calendar, ability to maintain less than a full term. Oklahoma statute generally requires that school be in session and classroom instruction be offered for 180 days or 1,080 hours. This may be waived if conditions beyond the control of local authorities warrant that waiver. I believe that in the circumstances that we are in, as discussed earlier, we would recommend this waiver be granted.
Do you want us to entertain a motion for each separately?
Yes.
Okay.
And just on that one really quickly, I think just emphasizing, and I know districts are doing this as far as, obviously I know that this is a waiver that's needed, especially from physical presence, but, encourage districts to continue to meet for the school year and continue learning through the school year will be hugely important to make sure that students don't fall behind during this time.
Yeah.
I'll move to approve that waiver.
Second.
Mr. Flanagan, second. Okay, any discussion? Thank you. Please call the roll.
Ms. Money.
Aye.
Mr. Bobeck.
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan.
Yes.
Ms. Bradley Williams.
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach.
Aye.
Ms. Hernandez.
Aye.
Superintendent Hofmeister.
Aye. Okay, that motion carries. Thank you. Next item.
Moving to, flexibility on the use of textbook funds. Pursuant to statute, school districts may individually apply to the State Board of Education for a waiver to authorize flexibility in the use of their state-appropriated textbook funding. If approved, each district may expend these monies allocated for any purpose related to the support and maintenance of the school district as determined by the local board. At this time, I believe the recommendation is a uniform waiver to districts and the flexibility in the use of these textbook funds, flexibility to use these funds for the support, but not for the maintenance of facilities of each school district. Would make that recommendation at this time.
Yes.
And just, I promise I won't ask a question about everyone, but this will allow, just to, emphasize, this will allow them, if they want to buy, kind of online software or anything in regard to kind of doing digital learning, this will allow them to use those textbook dollars for that.
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you for highlighting that. Is there a motion?
So moved.
All right, Ms. Monies made the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Ms. Carlisha Williams Bradley, second. All right. Please call the roll.
Ms. Hernandez.
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach.
Aye.
Ms. Bradley Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan,
Yes.
Mr. Bobeck,
Aye.
Ms. Money,
Aye.
Superintendent Hoffman.
Aye. All right, that motion carries. And now we come to one that we will consider tabling.
That is correct. It would be the recommendation to table this item at this time. It's on the agenda, however, we have provided guidance to districts on the convening of the reading teams that are set forth in the
For
statute.
those who might not be looking at an agenda, this is related to the Reading Sufficiency Act. And, excuse me, thank you.
No, thank you, Superintendent. The second piece is about flexibility on the use of funding. We have already provided guidance on that. At this time, we would recommend just tabling the item, believing that we've given the guidance at this time that we can.
Can you talk about for students that were potentially at risk of falling into the category of not being able to advance to the next school year? We talked earlier, but just to clarify for everybody listening at home, is it possible for reading teams to still meet virtually and kind of talk about specific reading plans for individual students? And is that, kind of being encouraged from the department?
Precisely, yes, and appreciate the plug for the FAQs and the guidance that we've put out.
That's right, and that's expected.
Yeah.
This is, the Reading Sufficiency Act is still in place. We expect our schools to rely on the information that they have about where their children are, particularly those in the kindergarten, first, second, and third grades, related to reading proficiency and grade level preparedness for being on track for third grade reading. What this also allows is for, again, the kind of work that has been permitted even before a global pandemic, which is for our schools to meet virtually, though, and to conduct the business around decisions for the right steps for a child after this grade level. And that's something that needs to be made with family and the teacher who knows them best and those that are outlined in that group that make this decision locally. But we do have guidance that will help. And we believe that all the flexibility is already in place at this time.
I just wanted to make sure that by tabling this, we aren't saying that the Reading Sufficiency Act still is not in place. So,
Right,
yeah.
very good. We see no need for a waiver right now because of what the steps we've already taken.
Okay.
Continue on?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The next item is on the reading assessment for a driver's license or permit. Generally speaking, Oklahoma statutes require that students demonstrate two things. One, that they are enrolled in a public school, for our purposes, a public school, and then secondarily that they have been taken the 8th grade reading assessment. I believe the recommendation at this time is to table that for a couple of reasons. In conversations with the Department of Public Safety, we believe that there's a solution in place that does not make this waiver appropriate or necessary at this time. The second reason, Lori Murphy will get into a rule later this morning on the agenda, an emergency rule that would authorize the granting of a medical exemption from those assessments, including the reading assessment that I just required, which would then be facilitated to DPS and distributed to their sites. So at this time, the recommendation is to table this item.
So just for clarification purposes, 8th graders will still be able to get their learning permit under, without needing a waiver based on the guidelines that you and DPS have been working on.
That is correct. Superintendent, board members, proceed to item 5. This is the school district audit acknowledgement. Just to give an overview, Oklahoma law requires that each school district have an annual audit. This audit must be presented to the school board, and a form, the audit acknowledgement form, must be accompanying the submission to the State Department of Education. Believe that these audits are either completed or substantially close to being completed. Districts who have in excess of $750,000 of certain funding must submit the audit form to the department by March 31st. And then if less than the $750,000, the date is April 30th. We believe at this time, and the recommendation is to waive the required form and proceed with submitting the audit so that that is not held up in the circumstances and times that we are in.
Okay.
Recommend approval.
Motion to approve?
Second.
All right, we have a motion to approve and a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Ms. Money,
Aye.
Mr. Bobeck,
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan,
Yes.
Ms. Bradley Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach,
Aye.
Ms. Hernandez,
Aye.
Superintendent Hoffman.
Aye, motion carries. Thank you. Now, item 3A6.
3A6. Relating to the instructional day of 6 hours, as set forth in section 1-111 of Title 70, that requires that the school day consist of not less than 6 hours devoted to school activities. Given the conversation in item 2 and continuing with some of the waivers we were talking about a moment ago on the school calendar, it seems appropriate at this time to recommend that we provide the flexibility to school districts. Recommend approval of this item.
So moved.
Okay, now, any discussion there? All right, thank you. Please, do we have a second?
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Hernandez,
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach,
Aye.
Ms. Bradley Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan,
Yes.
Mr. Bobeck,
Aye.
Ms. Money,
Aye.
Superintendent Hoffman.
Aye. All right, that motion carries. Thank you.
And proceeding along, item 7 is related to the general fund balance penalties and the waiver requests that are associated with them. Board members, in statute, there are certain amounts, certain allowances that are provided for in the statutes that district general fund balances cannot exceed. And if they do exceed those numbers for 2 consecutive years, there is a penalty in statutes that is to be imposed by April 1. This is on a sliding scale based on the prior year's general fund balance. And general fund, generally speaking, is the operational fund account for a school. Statutes authorize districts to appeal to the State Board of Education. This is a matter of ordinary business that would come to the board. We do have in front of you the districts who submitted the appeals in a timely manner. Those districts, I'll just read them aloud for everyone participating: Burlington, Cherokee, Timberlake, Sayre, Banner, Calumet, Sealing, Taloga, Deer Creek, Lamont, Okarche, Alene, Clio, Chotomezi, Frontier, Kiowa, Raiden, Cheyenne, Hammond, Alva, and Fort Supply. We would recommend approval of this item at this time.
To be clear, it's giving all districts
Our recommendation
versus, or just those?
is the districts who timely submitted an appeal, the ones that I just identified, to grant those waivers. The others would not have submitted, or either they could have accepted the penalty for their own reasons.
Okay.
But our recommendation is to approve those who requested in a timely manner.
So moved.
All right, we have a motion, Mr. Bobeck, and is there a second?
Second.
And a second. All right. Please call the roll.
Ms. Money,
Aye.
Mr. Bobeck,
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan,
Yes.
Ms. Bradley Williams? Mr. Bolenbach?
Aye.
Ms. Hernandez?
Aye.
Superintendent Hofmeister?
Aye. Thank you, that motion carries. Item 3A8.
And this is the final item that we would request tabling this morning. And if there are questions or discussion, I'm happy to explain, but if not, continue proceeding along.
Thank you.
Item 9 are the cooperative agreements for alternative education programs. Board members, I believe this item will be familiar to you. Statutes require that any district serving fewer than 10 students shall enter into a cooperative agreement with another school district. Again, given the conversation this morning, the CDC guidelines, it seems very appropriate to waive this requirement in statute at this time.
So moved.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Thank you. Please call the roll.
Ms. Money?
Aye.
Mr. Bobeck?
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan?
Yes.
Ms. Bradley Williams?
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach?
Aye.
Ms. Hernandez?
Aye.
Superintendent Hofmeister?
Aye. Motion carries. Thank you.
Okay, next, board members, item 10, library media services. This is one that is, again, probably familiar to you on prior agendas. Generally, these requirements are certain staffing numbers per student set forth in rule. Again, given the conversation earlier, where we are, would recommend approval to free up districts and afford the flexibility here.
Is there a motion?
So moved.
A second?
Second.
Mr. Flanagan has the second. Thank you. Please call the roll.
Ms. Hernandez?
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach?
Aye.
Ms. Bradley Williams?
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan?
Yes.
Mr. Bobeck?
Aye.
Ms. Money?
Aye.
Superintendent Hofmeister?
Aye. All right, thank you. That motion carries.
Okay, Superintendent, board members, next item relates to teacher leader effectiveness and the statutes that correspond to that. The statutes that I'm referring to generally require that each district board of education adopt a policy and annually review that policy for the evaluation of professional staff. Teachers are to be evaluated consistent with the provisions of the statutes and the local policy. I believe it's reasonable at this point, the circumstances we are in, this is a proactive movement all around to distance learning, and this waiver requests the same thing to free up districts to be able to serve the students in the methods and the resources that they have, and not adhere to the rubrics that quite likely will not align to this distance learning that we are talking about today.
The only thing that I would say there, I agree for the need for the waiver, but I would hope that school leaders would continue to audit the, continuous learning opportunities. And I know that there will be groups of teachers that are, especially mentor teachers. A lot of what happens with TLE is, making sure that some of the newer teachers have mentor teachers. And I hope that work will continue online and kind of virtually among teachers and school leaders in their building to make sure that especially newer teachers are still getting the support that they need from more veteran teachers and kind of their school leaders within their school building. I'll move approval.
All right. And a second.
Second.
And a second, Ms. Hernandez. Any further discussion? Thank you. Please call the roll.
Ms. Money?
Aye.
Mr. Bobeck?
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan?
Yes.
Ms. Bradley Williams?
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach?
Aye.
Ms. Hernandez?
Aye.
Superintendent Hofmeister?
Aye. Motion carries.
All right, Superintendent, board members, these next two items, both in statute in different locations, but both relate to graduation requirements. The first relates to CPR requirements that must be offered and completed before a student graduates. The second relates to physical education requirements that are set out in detail in the statutes. Again, sorry to harp on this, but given the conversation from earlier, where we are with distance learning, of course, some of this may be possible, but this is another attempt to encourage flexibility and to ease minds of the professional staff in schools. We would encourage the relaxation, deregulation of CPR requirements first.
So moved.
Thank you. We have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, very good. Thank you. Please call the roll.
Ms. Hernandez.
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach.
Mr. Bolenbach?
Aye.
Ms. Bradley Williams.
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan.
Yes.
Mr. Bobeck.
Aye.
Ms. Money.
Aye.
Superintendent Hofmeister.
Aye. All right, thank you. That motion carries. Next is physical education, item 13.
So moved.
Second? Is there a second?
Second.
All right, thank you. Please call the roll.
Ms. Money.
Aye.
Mr. Bobeck.
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan.
Yes.
Ms. Bradley Williams.
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach.
Aye.
Ms. Hernandez.
Aye.
Superintendent Hofmeister.
Aye. Thank you. Motion carries. Item 14, abbreviated school day, and this is related to alternative education.
Thank you, Superintendent. Statutes authorize the State Board of Education to define the length of a school day for alternative education programs. This body has done that, setting that at 756 hours at a minimum. Going back to what I keep saying, if the waivers granted earlier on about the school calendar, the minimum length of the instructional day, it is appropriate and recommended to waive this requirement as well.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, a motion and a second. Please call the roll.
Ms. Hernandez.
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach.
Aye.
Ms. Bradley Williams.
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan.
Yes.
Mr. Bobeck.
Aye.
Ms. Hernandez.
Aye.
Superintendent Hofmeister.
Aye. All right, that motion carries. Item 15.
Okay, board members, Section 6-187, 187 of the Oklahoma statutes authorizes this body to grant emergency certifications to individuals. I believe we have 30 requests that were timely submitted before you. Would recommend approval at this time. And then also later on the agenda, Ms. Murphy will talk through and present a proposed emergency certification rule. So further discussion coming on this topic, but at this time, the recommendation is to grant those 30.
So moved.
Okay, Mr. Bobeck has a second. We have a motion already, and now please call the roll.
Ms. Money.
Aye.
Mr. Bobeck.
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan.
Yes.
Ms. Bradley Williams.
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach.
Aye.
Ms. Hernandez.
Aye.
Superintendent Hofmeister.
Aye, thank you. That motion carries as well. Item 16, school district and school site accreditation recommendations.
Thank you, Superintendent. This body issues accreditation over the public schools in the state of Oklahoma. At this time, we would recommend pausing those reviews on-site compliance visits with the caveat, the recommendation would include that should a situation present itself and it become necessary, that this body could reopen, re-examine, and modify that recommendation.
Can I ask a question about, so the regional accreditation officers, are they still going to be in touch with schools and kind of ensuring that even though site visits, during this time are not allowed, can you kind of talk through what that might look like from an accreditation standpoint to make sure that school districts are still adhering to as much as they can?
Yeah, I think you said it very well. The RAOs, the regional accreditation officers, have continuous contact with school districts, the leaders in schools, and that will continue. But I think it's fair to say, rather than focusing on when the accreditation officer is going to be on site and when this paperwork, for example, has to be submitted, like the audit acknowledgement form, for example, we would recommend shifting the attention to the distance learning that we've been talking about this morning, and that to the maximum extent that this body would authorize, focus on that and not necessarily on those visits and on-site reviews.
I
At
definitely.
the same time,
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I didn't. No, I was saying I appreciate this waiver just in thinking about the shift from compliance to serving our students the best we can during this time, even if the RAOs could switch gears and thinking about how they're getting information back to the OSD about additional supports that school sites or district leaders need during this time versus the regular checkpoints of paperwork that don't always relate to the tangible needs that exist in this moment of crisis. So I definitely appreciate this waiver being included.
Thank you.
So moved.
School districts that are under review right now that should not carry with this waiver any actions to date, or do we? I guess that's my question is: do we have any school districts that are currently under review for this matter that we have a concern about?
At this time, Mr. Flanagan, I believe the recommendation is to continue with the uniform pause on accreditation on-site compliance reviews. And the reason I mentioned for that slight caveat that this body could reopen, modify, amend this action is to your point exactly. If a situation presents itself that we could reopen that on a case-by-case basis as necessary, but at this time, I don't have any that we are recommending to carve out of that.
Thanks.
All right, we have a motion and a second, I believe. Do we? No. We need a second.
Second.
Second. All right, thank you. Please call the roll.
Ms. Hernandez.
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach.
Aye.
Ms. Bradley Williams.
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan.
Yes.
Mr. Bobek.
Aye.
Ms. Manning.
Aye.
Superintendent Hall.
Aye, thank you. Motion carries. Item 17.
Okay, Superintendent, board members, wrapping up here. Item 17 relates to the time period in which to calculate certified and legal average daily attendance. The statutes that are cited on the agenda generally state that the legal and certified average daily attendance is the average number of students present in a school district during a given school year, or as that year is otherwise specified by this body. Knowing that from March 12th forward, the attendance situations, particularly as we move to from the board's order on March 16th into the distance learning, that is going to vary greatly. We have that realization and would suggest, for stability purposes, that we reset that time period for legal and certified average daily attendance at March 12th as the ending point.
So it would go from the start of the school year to March 12th, and the average daily attendance across that time period is what the ADA would be for the year.
That is correct.
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second? We have a motion
Second.
and a second. Any discussion? All right, please call the roll.
Ms. Mendes?
Aye.
Mr. Bobeck?
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan?
Yes.
Ms. Bradley Williams?
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach?
Aye.
Hernandez?
Aye.
Superintendent Hopper?
Aye. All right, that motion carries. And one final under this section 3A, number 18.
Thank you. Similar to the previous item, that same section of statute defines average daily membership. So in the earlier item, we were talking about average daily attendance. This item relates to average daily membership. That is defined as the average number of students present and absent in the school district during a school year. There are provisions that require a district to take a student off of the roster. Again, knowing where we are from March 16th forward with the authorizations that we've been discussing, authorizing this morning. Again, for stability, it makes sense, and the recommendation is to set that from the beginning of the school year through March 12th. That's Thursday, March 12th, I believe.
All right.
Mr. Clark, can you talk about, obviously, whenever we're talking about ADA and ADM, we're talking about school funding.
Yes.
Does this, just to be clear for everyone watching at home, this essentially allows funding to continue at the levels based on the attendance from the start of the school year to March 12th. So this should not impact school funding for any schools across Oklahoma.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. So moved.
Thank you. There is a motion. Is there a second?
Forget what I
Second.
can say anymore.
And we have a second. All right, thank you. Please call the roll.
Ms. Hernandez?
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach?
Aye.
Ms. Bradley Williams?
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan?
Yes.
Mr. Bobeck?
Aye.
Mendes?
Aye.
Superintendent Hopper?
Aye. All right, that motion carries. Thank you. And now, if you'll turn your attention to the next page, and we have item 3D, which we're asking Assistant General Counsel Lori Murphy to present discussion and possible action on the adoption of the following emergency rules pursuant to the Oklahoma Administrative Procedures Act. Ms. Murphy.
Good morning, honorable members of the board here and at home. You have 3 emergency rules to consider today, and then 4 regular rules. I would recommend 1 vote for each, probably 1 vote for emergency and then a separate vote for specific rules.
All right.
So to take you through the emergency measures, and these are again based on all of the emergency situations we've been discussing this morning. The first recommended rule change is an amendment to section 210.10.13.23. This is the rule on emergency exemptions from the Oklahoma School Testing Program, and this is an existing rule on emergency medical exemptions being available to students who meet the criteria and that are not included in OSTP assessment. So what this proposed amendment provides is that if an emergency that impacts public school operations is declared by a federal or state entity, including this board, then the State Department of Education is authorized to approve medical exemptions for any students who are affected by that emergency. But then it further provides that if a state of emergency suspends or interrupts school operations during the testing window itself, then the State Department would be authorized to issue a blanket medical exemption to all students affected. And what that would mean is if, for instance, you can't attend school because your school is closed down due to a public health emergency, then that would give OSDE the authority to give a blanket exemption from those OSTP assessments. So any questions on that rule?
Just to be clear, this emergency rule is kind of bolstered by the federal waiver that we received from testing.
It
correct?
is.
Okay.
And many of these emergency provisions are interrelated with and dependent on those emergencies.
So they are federal laws, but they're also in state law.
Okay.
We have a very similar emergency adoption, And this is technically a new rule, but this will be familiar because you adopted a permanent version of this in the fall. But because that is still under consideration by the legislature, this needs to be an emergency adoption. Some of this content will be familiar. This is a rule that the board adopted last fall called Determination of the Chronic Absenteeism Indicator. And so what that rule provides is shifting authority, if you remember, to local school districts to grant medical exemptions from chronic absenteeism. So what this emergency provision would provide is that, again, in case of a declared emergency by a federal or state government entity that impacts schools, the Oklahoma School Accountability System is authorized to make any appropriate accommodations that are authorized by federal law. And so specifically, the rule provides that student absences related to a state of emergency shall not be included in the calculation of the chronic absenteeism indicator. And to further back that up, there's an emergency statement that if there's any period of time during a state of emergency when public school operations are suspended, then that time period will be excluded from the chronic absenteeism calculations. In much the same way as ADA and ADM, the waiver that we had just discussed, would have cut off at a certain date.
So when looking at the chronic absenteeism indicator moving forward, assuming we resume normal operations in the fall, would it be that same time period from the start of school to March 12th that would be the consideration?
Yes,
for,
if I understand
for chronic
your question
absenteeism?
correctly. Yes, we're for this school year. However, while those calculations may be made, I believe federal waivers in play will have more of an effect than this on this year's determination.
Okay.
Makes sense. Does anyone else have any questions about either of these first two emergencies? Your final emergency rule consideration is an amendment to section 210-2994. This is period of validity of certificates. So this is the rule that lays out the validity period of every type of certificate, standard, emergency. And what the emergency provisions here provide is that the state board would be authorized to issue an emergency certificate for a third year rather than the current limit of 2 total years per individual if a district board of education makes a recommendation that someone should receive that for a third year and meets the criteria. And this, again, is in part to respond to the current emergency scenario that we have and the circumstances that may put districts in. So the criteria that would have to be met include that the individual has a rating of effective or higher on their last TLE evaluation, that the employing school district submits a portfolio of their work, including their progress towards standard certification, and that the school district submits evidence of their attempts to hire a teacher who holds a standard certificate. So the same showings that must be made to initially receive an emergency certificate, plus essentially evidence that their performance has been satisfactory at the district.
Can I ask, so to be clear, this would just allow them to request a third year.
Yes.
All of that will still come before this
Yeah.
board
Still this
for
board's
approval.
authority.
That's a really good point. Thank you.
It is.
for bringing that up.
This extends the board's authority to a third year of potential emergency certificates.
Okay.
This is going to be a very disruptive period of time when ordinarily schools are beginning to plan for their hiring needs for the fall, and extending this emergency certification further helps with some of those concerns.
So those are the final 3 emergency rules that will be a separate emergency consideration, if you'd like to.
Okay. So then you've explained each of them. Do you want a separate vote, or are we able to?
I believe one vote to cover the
One vote for all the emergencies. Okay. So as you have heard this explanation of the 3 emergency rules that are here before you, is there a motion to approve them?
Motion to approve.
Is there a second? Thank you.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All right, please call the roll.
Ms. Money?
Aye.
Mr. Bovek?
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan? Mr. Flanagan?
Yes.
Ms. Bradley Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach,
Aye.
Ms. Hernandez,
Aye.
Superintendent Hofmeister.
Aye. All right, that motion carries. And now, board members, we have the discussion of permanent rules to consider on item C.
Thank you. And these are presented to you today because of a statutory deadline on submitting approved rules to the legislature, which is April 1st. So we are closing your regular permanent rule considerations for the year.
Can I ask one question on that? Obviously, the legislature is currently in suspension. If these rules, in addition to previous rules that we've submitted to the legislature, can you talk about the process by which, if they don't take those up?
If the Administrative Procedures Act provides that if the Oklahoma legislature does not consider a joint resolution to approve the rules or fails to consider them in any way, then the governor has the authority to approve or disapprove the rules. Generally, that would be one order of the governor approving all pending rules, although exclusions could be made just like the legislature can make exclusions. So prior to last year, I believe the previous 4 years, that's actually how rules were adopted, is that the legislature did not ultimately vote on the pending agency rules. They went through the process of review, but then the governor made the approval under the Administrative Procedures Act. So that is how that would operate if there was some sort of scenario that delayed that approval.
So there is still a mechanism to get approval for the rules, even if the legislature does not act.
And the deadline of April 1, if I recall, is still in place for submission of those.
Right, so that's why we're considering the rest of your permanent rules. And I'll take you briefly through those. Number C1 on your agenda, this is an amendment to the Oklahoma Academic Scholar Recognition Rule. This is the rule that lays out requirements for a student obtaining the Oklahoma Academic Scholar status, which is a status of distinction, and it is being updated to add eligibility criteria for a seal of biliteracy. This is something that the World Languages Office is very excited about. The seal of biliteracy, which is something that other states have developed as well, will indicate that a student has demonstrated proficiency in both English and another language. And this is something that is available both to native English speakers and to students who speak a different primary language. The seal of biliteracy will be available in 2 levels of distinction based on levels of achievement in the languages. Those levels are gold and platinum. And there are eligibility criteria in the rule for performance in both English and other languages. So for performance in English, students can use any of the standardly available standardized tests like ACT, SAT, PSAT, AP. And for demonstrating their proficiency in other languages, either an AP test could be used for that, or any other test. There's a list of several available assessments that are standardized in the field of languages. And if there is a language for which there is not a standard assessment, the rule provides that the State Department of Education will work with an appropriate linguistic or cultural entity to identify what would be appropriate for that. So any questions about adding a seal of biliteracy to the distinction? Okay, your next proposed rule. This is a new proposed rule, Guidelines for Minimizing Seclusion and Restraint of Students. This is a new rule in the Special Education subchapter of Curriculum and Instruction. So this rule codifies guidelines for a school's use of either student seclusion or physical restraint as a means of short-term emergency intervention. So to just quickly define that, seclusion is the involuntary confinement of a student alone in an area which the student is physically prevented from leaving, and that is a federal definition incorporated into the rule. Physical restraint is defined as a personal restriction that immobilizes or reduces the ability of a student to move their torso, arms, legs, or head freely. So these are emergency interventions that should only be undertaken under appropriate circumstances, which is what the rule addresses. The rule provides that in order to place a student in seclusion or restraint, several conditions must be met, including that the situation is an emergency with an imminent threat of danger to a person, not just property. And the other key requirement is that the school personnel involved are appropriately trained. And the rule also prohibits schools from applying corporal punishment to students with disabilities served under the IDEA. And the last provision of this rule is directing schools to submit an end-of-year report for easier tracking purposes of all of these incidents that occur. Any questions about this proposed rule or any of its content? All right,
Yes, please continue.
your third consideration is a set of 4 rules. This is updates to the Reading Sufficiency Act, and these rules are being amended to incorporate changes to the governing law and related program updates. You'll see the terminology has been updated to reflect current statutes and the renaming of assessment components. There is a new provision proposed in Section 210.15.27.1 addressing submission and funding requirements. I would identify this as a new area of content. Historically, there has been delays in the distribution of RSA funding because data must be received from all districts before the funding can be calculated and dispersed. So the new funding provision that's proposed associates the RSA data submission deadlines with eligibility for funding to avoid those delays that we've seen in timely distribution and get those RSA funds available to districts to provide to students in a timely manner. Some programmatic changes that were originally proposed as part of this amendment have been withdrawn from recommendation following public comment, and you will see that language reflected in your draft. And those issues will now be addressed through additional guidance that is currently being developed by the Office of Curriculum and Instruction. So do you have any questions about RSA changes or this update? All right, your last permanent rule consideration for the year is Section 210.40.87.7 Charter School Contracts. And very simply, this is an amendment to the Charter School Contract Rule. It only applies to charter schools sponsored by this board, and it incorporates the provisions that currently apply to contracts between charter schools and the SVCSB, the Statewide Virtual Charter School Board, just as a template of guidelines for an agency sponsoring a charter school. So any questions about charter schools or any of that content? That closes out your permanent rule considerations for this evening as well.
Right, very good. Is there a motion to consider these recommendations with permanent rules? And then we can have discussion.
So moved.
All right, we have a motion with Mr. Hernandez. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Bolenbach, second. All right, very good. Any discussion?
I had a question because the audio went out when she was describing the last point on the charter school. Laura, would you repeat that for me, please?
Yes, the charter school rule amendment, it specifically only applies to charter schools sponsored by the State Board of Education, and those new incorporated provisions are parallel to the provisions that SVCSB applies to their charter schools as a template for an agency contracting to be a charter school sponsor. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
All right, we have a motion and a second, and seeing no further questions or discussion, please call the roll.
Ms. Hernandez?
Aye.
Mr. Bolenbach?
Aye.
Ms. Bradley Williams?
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan?
Yes.
Mr. Bobeck?
Aye.
Ms. Money?
Aye.
Aye. All right, this motion carries, and I appreciate very much the hard work of your team and legal with those rules, Mrs. State. Board members, we are to a place now of entertaining an adjournment. Oh, yes.
Yes, before we do that, I want to make it clear before this body adjourns, and I would like Mr. Clark's input on this, going to the first motion that we did with our First Amendment
Yes.
on the order. I want to make it clear that when it comes to our extracurricular activities and our sports, we have schools across the state that, of course, are at a very high level when it comes to athletics. And I want to ensure that what we voted on does not permanently cancel where they're at. I understand because of CDC guidelines, they can't get together, only 10
Right.
or less. So therefore, it has to be postponed. So this body is not saying that we are suspending any athletic activities that school districts may opt to continue in the future.
Yes.
And school districts can decide to continue with tournaments as scheduled, that they can continue with any, a lot of our athletes are actually being looked at to be recruited into universities. So this is all lingering. So I want to make sure that anything that's being put out there by media, it is not taking the wind out of our athletes saying we are completely canceling all of our sports in the state of Oklahoma. Is that so? Because that can be amended.
Sure. Thank you. The ending of the order as voted on applies to the entire order, and that ending that I'm referring to, the last paragraph says, this order and the situation will be closely monitored, as we have all done, by the minutes in most cases, and so that if necessary, it can be amended. We talked about that earlier. So that's a partial answer to your question. The remainder of the answer is adhering to the CDC guidelines, as you mentioned. It would be very hard to have a basketball game, 5-on-5 and a referee, not adhering to the CDC guidelines. But there may be other circumstances. They're going to vary case by case. It's my understanding and would be my recommendation that the intent of the order is, number one priority is student, staff, person safety. Then shift to the instructional capacity as voted on. And, with number one, adhering to the CDC guidelines. But if a situation presents itself, we certainly don't want to negatively impact students, which is another part of the order, graduation, scholarship. Otherwise, we talked about OLAP on the academic side. So I understand. I'm just trying to answer the question as fully as I can with the intent of the order.
And CDC guidelines change because things change week by week, day by day.
Right.
That if those items with the CDC change, then we can revisit this and change the order to be able to continue on with any future sports, athletic, already scheduled, and push them to the future and allow school districts to determine. So
absolutely, and just to illustrate that point exactly, in the distance learning framework, initially there was a reference to groups of 10 or more, and we changed that late last night to say adhering to CDC guidelines, because those may change. They could go to 6, they could go to 12, and so, and in an effort to not have to continuously update the document, we wanted to put that in the document the way it is, and the same thing with this order.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for that. I also have update news that since this meeting started, we now have an update that 164 cases have been confirmed with COVID-19 right here in Oklahoma, and we have 5 deaths. So this is a dynamic, fluid situation. We have made recommendations. This board has taken action to respond to those needed steps to continue to safeguard our children, our school members of the faculty and support staff, and the families that they all represent in communities. And it underscores the way this is going to have embedded flexibility to respond to be current with CDC guidance. And yet we know, again, underscoring again, this is not permanent. This is a temporary measure. We don't know the lengths it will endure, but it is worth the struggle to schools to keep learning going while we maintain a level of security that we would not have without the board action today. And I thank each one of you for the conversations that you have with the public, with those who reach out to you, many text messages and phone calls, emails, posts on Facebook, questions that people have are all truly appreciated. This is part of being responsive to the public during a time where we need answers. And we want to be able to give as much specificity as possible, and I believe we have done that in an additional way today with this action. So I do thank each one of you, and for those who have additional questions, more of those answers and specificity will come with the guidance that we are planning to publish this week and before the start of April 6th, when we expect our schools to continue the learning for students. At this time, I would entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
All right, there is a motion. Is there a second? And before I call that roll call, are there any other comments from board members?
I just echo Board Member Hernandez's comments about, we're listening to community members. I will say, as far as athletic events and graduations and all of these things, with great sympathy, we're making the decisions to keep all of our community safe. I think about the priority of learning and knowing that that can continue to happen and continue to exist. I just, again, am so grateful for this board, for the leadership at the State Department, for leading us through these unknown times and knowing that critical decisions are being made on the forefront to ensure that our students are safe. I'd rather at the end of the day be known as overreacting and keeping individuals safe. That means that we're actually doing the right thing. If it seems like this is an overreaction versus an underreaction and doing something too late. And so I'm just really proud of the work that's continuing to move forward, the support of our entire community, because it's going to take all of us to make this happen and to serve our students. I just, again, want to say thank you. And to everyone that has reached out, we hear you, we understand, and we want to be here to support you during this time as well.
And I think just to echo that, to assure the public and everyone impacted by this, that this board is being very, vigilant as far as, monitoring the situation, which, a couple of weeks ago, we didn't know that we would be here today. And so it is, an ever-evolving issue that, I know the State Department has been very much on top of, and we will continue to monitor it. And I know, we've already had 2 emergency meetings. That's something that I know that we're not afraid to do if the circumstances change and that we need to get back together to make any adjustments based on kind of the evolving situation. So just to assure the public that this is something that we're continuing to monitor and can adjust if needed.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Any other comments? All right. Then call the roll for adjournment.
Ms. Money?
Aye.
Mr. Bobek?
Aye.
Mr. Flanagan?
Yes.
Bradley Williams?
Aye.
Mr. Ballenbach?
Aye.
Ms. Hernandez?
Aye.
Superintendent Hoffman?
Aye. All right, we are adjourned, and we will stay in touch. Thank you so much for your service. We will have media availability in just a moment, and I'll let others make any announcements that are needed related to that.
Yeah, excuse me, I would just say news media, just call in on the Uber conference line in just a couple of minutes, and we'll start then.
All right. Very good.
Sorry
Thank you. I'm going to step in here before.
No, that's good.